Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to the second plenary session of the Money, Macro and Finance Conference this year. I am in Cambridge. I wish I could welcome everybody to Cambridge. I think we will have the opportunity at some point in the future to do that. I hope not too far into the future. I would like to welcome Jordi virtually to this session. And I'm lucky because I don't have it's very easy for me to introduce Jordi because he's such a household name for the macro group anyway, that there's not a lot I need to say. I would call him the godfather of new Keynesian macro, if I can use this expression. He has done numerous contributions in the field in the new Keynesian macroeconomics, thought about monetary policy, business cycle fluctuations. This is what he will talk about today as well. He has this beautiful book on monetary policy and business cycles, which is kind of standard textbook now for graduate students on the topic. He's very well cited. He has done a lot of, well-known papers and worked on many aspects of new Keynesian macro. Probably his most known work is the papers with his long-term collaborators, co-workers, Richard Clarida and Mark Kettler, that a lot of us know very well. We've read the papers and we know them by heart almost. He worked a few years in New York in different locations before moving to Barcelona, where he was instrumental for the success of CREI. That is a great place to visit. I've been there myself, and I really think it's a superb research institution. And, Jordi is one of the people that not only is a beautiful, brilliant researcher, but is also actively involved in policy. He has links to ECB, other policy institutions. And importantly, he has guided and trained and supervised several graduate students over the years that are now themselves prominent figures in macroeconomic research. So overall, a very influential figure in our discipline. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over and we can start the session. We have 40 minutes for the talk. I'd like to remind everybody that if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat here in Zoom, or you can use Whova as a platform for the questions. These questions will be collected during the presentation, and we will talk about the questions after the presentation. But anything that springs to mind that you would like to share, please go ahead and add your questions as the talk goes on. All right, thank you. Jordi, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Chrissy, for your kind introduction, and thanks also to the Money, Macro and Finance Society for the invitation to give this lecture. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity. So my talk today will deal with aggregate economic fluctuations, which is a phenomenon that I have always found fascinating, and which in many respects was what drove me into the profession. So let me illustrate the topic of fluctuations by just showing a figure that displays the evolution of what particular variable. I could have chosen any other variables. This is the employment rate in the US over the post-war period, and this is a variable that displays the ups and downs that characterize what we know as the business cycle. Okay. Understanding the nature of these fluctuations in employment, but also in other aggregate variables like output or consumption, investment, and so on, seems a worthy enterprise. In particular, given that these fluctuations involve periods that we call recessions, in which employment, consumption, output, and other variables go down in a way that causes pain to many people, and in a way that it's puzzling because in most such episodes there is no fundamental reason in terms of destruction of the capital stock or human capital or major institutional collapses, as those associated with a war, say, that would seem to justify a decline in economic activity. And yet, this phenomenon of a recession is recurrent in all modern advanced economies. Now, the main goal of my talk will be to describe the key elements of a particular approach to understanding economic fluctuations, the so-called new Keynesian approach. Now, this is a view that has become dominant over the past 2 decades and provides the foundations for many of the models that central banks and international organizations have developed. And as you all know, this approach combines some of the elements and insights of the traditional Keynesian economics, much of them originating in our host's campus, and with the tools and the language of modern macroeconomic theory. So here's the outline of my talk. So in order to motivate the need for this new Keynesian approach, I will start by discussing some of the challenges that any attempt to interpret aggregate fluctuations through the lens of neoclassical economics will face. Okay. Then I will propose a flexible approach to model departures from that neoclassical framework. That's what I will call an economy with wedges. And the new Keynesian approach can be viewed as a particular case, or the new Keynesian framework can be viewed as a particular case of such an economy with wedges. So what I will do is briefly describe the key elements of that framework. And in order to illustrate some of the radically different implications that the new Keynesian framework has relative to the neoclassical framework, I will use the topic on which I have been working for the past 10 years or so, which is the gains from wage flexibility. Okay, so we'll revisit the gains from wage flexibility through the lens of this new Keynesian framework. And then I will just conclude. Okay. Now, again, let's start by looking at the difficulties that the neoclassical model of the business cycle would face in order to interpret the data. And in order to make this point, let me use the simplest model economy. You can think of this as the most basic RBC model, with a representative household, a representative firm, single good, and just one input, labor, and standard preferences and technology. Okay. Now, on this chassis, if you want, we're going to embed 2 assumptions that define what I call the neoclassical approach, namely the assumptions of perfect competition and fully flexible prices and wages. Okay, so here we have, so let me assume, and that's an assumption that I will maintain throughout the talk, that again, there's this infinitely lived representative household that has this, whose preferences are described by this utility function. This is a standard, the notation, I think it is a standard, so I don't need to go into detail. Just let me say that this Xi parameter is meant to be an exogenous shock to labor disutility, and Z is just an exogenous shock to the discount factor. Okay, so these will be two of the shocks that that I will introduce. And now, for a household who with those preferences, and one of the optimality conditions, and I should say for a household with those preferences and with access to a perfectly competitive labor market, okay, with no quantity constraints, okay, one of the optimality conditions is given by this equation that you see here. Okay, this is an equation that equates the real wage, okay, the nominal wage divided by the price level, to the marginal rate of substitution, okay, or if you want, the marginal disutility of labor expressed in terms of consumption goods, okay? And for much of what follows, I'm going to be using log linear versions of some of the optimality conditions or equilibrium conditions that we will derive or discuss. And here is the log linear version, okay, of this optimality condition above, with the lowercase letters denoting the natural logs of the original variables. Okay, so we have that the real wage equals the marginal rate of substitution at all times. Now let's look at firms. Let's assume that there is a large number of identical firms producing a single good with this technology. Okay, AT is an exogenous technology parameter, and N is labor input. The optimality condition, the profit maximization condition, is well known to all of us. It says that firms should hire labor up to the point where the marginal product of labor equals the real wage. Okay, remember, this is a firm that faces no demand constraints and takes prices and wages as given. Okay, and in logs, we can write it, this optimality condition like this. This is what we would call a labor demand schedule. And we can rearrange the terms in this optimality condition and rewrite it in an alternative fashion, namely one that equates the price to this expression. This is just the nominal wage minus the marginal product of labor, all in logs, and this corresponds to the marginal cost, okay, which I'm going to denote by psi t. Okay, so the optimality condition can be restated as the price equals the price being equal to a marginal cost at all times. Now we can equate labor demand and labor supply that we have derived and make the assumption, okay, that it's an inherent assumption to the neoclassical model, namely that we have a Walrasian equilibrium in which the wage somehow adjusts automatically so that labor supply equals labor demand at all times. And that determines the wage, the real wage, and employment, okay? Very good. And here we have the equation that describes that equilibrium. So labor supply equals labor demand. Now, this is equivalent to marginal rate of substitution being equal to the marginal product of labor at all times, which is an efficiency condition. Okay, so what this is saying is that the equilibrium in this economy will be efficient, not surprisingly, because all the assumptions of the welfare theorems hold in this simple model. Now let's ask ourselves, in this framework, and I notice that I have introduced just a few elements. Okay, this is not a full-fledged model. In this framework, how can we generate fluctuations in employment? Okay, so let's just rearrange terms in this labor market equilibrium equation that we have at the top and solve for N for employment. Okay, and we have an expression or employment as a function of the technology parameter, the labor supply shock, consumption, and some exogenous parameters. Okay, so so there are three possible ways of generating fluctuations in employment. Two are kind of obvious: shocks to technology and shocks to labor supply shocks will, move employment around. Okay, but then we can also have other shocks, okay, other than labor supply and technology shocks, that may have an effect on equilibrium employment through their potential impact on consumption. Okay, given that changes in consumption, other things equal, will shift the labor supply through a wealth effect. Okay, so now let's consider these three possibilities one at a time. And let me start with the last one. Okay, so consider shocks other than technology or labor supply shocks. Okay, now in that case, these two terms here will be constant, and hence we will have a negative co-movement. Any fluctuations driven by those shocks will necessarily imply a negative co-movement between employment and consumption. Okay, so that's a prediction of the model. Now, this prediction, okay, and here you see how, in terms of the labor market diagram, how it would work. So this is a recession generated by those shocks, a recession in terms of employment. Okay, so we have that whatever the shock hits the economy increases consumption, that shifts back the labor supply schedule because of the negative wealth effect and on labor supply, and that reduces employment. Okay, now what's the problem with this is that this prediction of the model is clearly violated by the data. Okay, here you have a plot of the trended log consumption and the trended log employment in the US economy, and we can see, and as we know, both these two variables are strongly positively correlated. The correlation is 0.61. Okay, in fact, business cycles can be described as fluctuations, as positive movements in those variables, if we will. Okay, so that discards a large number of potential shocks. How about technology shocks? Well, technology shocks, of course, could generate fluctuations in employment, okay, through the impact on labor demand. So here we have a recession, an illustration of a recession generated by a negative technology shock, whatever that means, okay? The negative technology shock hits or shifts the labor demand schedule to the left, and it lowers employment, okay? Now, what's the problem with this? Well, that the framework predicts a positive movement between technology and the technology parameter, or measure of technology, and employment, okay? But if we look at the data, okay, and here I'm showing you again the trended log employment in red and the trended log TFP as measured using the adjustment proposed by John Fernald, which is generally viewed as the best measure of technology. We see that such a positive correlation is nowhere to be found in the data. In fact, the correlation between the two variables is negative. This is somewhat related to the evidence that I showed in a paper in 99, which showed how positive technology shocks actually have negative effects on employment in the short run. Okay, so that rules out technology shocks as a dominant source of fluctuations. How about labor supply shocks? Well, labor supply shocks can also, of course, generate fluctuations in employment, okay, through shifts in the labor supply, exogenous shifts in the labor supply in a trivial way. Now, an implication of labor supply shocks is that they would generate a negative movement between the real wage and employment. Okay, so here we have a recession generated by a labor supply shock, and we see that employment goes down, whereas the real wage goes up. Okay, now do we observe that in the data? No, again, we don't. It's a prediction that is not verified in the data. The correlation between those two variables, employment and the real wage in blue, now employment in red, again, is slightly positive, if anything. Okay, the real wage is slightly pro-cyclical relative to employment, not counter-cyclical as labor supply shocks would imply. Okay, so these counterfactual predictions again make it very hard for this neoclassical framework to be reconciled with observed aggregate fluctuation. So we need to depart one way or another from that framework. That's the argument that I want to put forward today. And a very general and way to do so is by somehow freeing ourselves from the straitjacket of perfect competition and flexible prices and wages, which is embedded in the neoclassical framework that I just described, and allowing for wedges, okay, what I will call, and many economists call wedges between the real wage and the marginal rate of substitution, okay, and that I'm going to denote by mu W and refer to it as the wage markup, okay, and a wedge between the marginal product of labor and the real wage, and that I'm going to denote by mu P and refer to it as the price markup, because if you rearrange these terms, you can see, you can write this as the gap between the price and the marginal cost. So it has the natural interpretation of the price markup. But again, these are just labels. Okay. Now it is a natural implication of many models with wedges that such markups have to be non-negative. Okay. The reason is that you cannot force people to work more than they want to, at least in civilized societies, and you cannot force firms to produce and sell goods at the price below marginal cost. They can always refuse to do so. Okay, so these markups should be non-negative. Now, how these markups relate to fluctuations and to the efficiency of fluctuations? So let me introduce a variable that we introduced in this paper with Mark Gertler and Lopez Salido in 2007. That's what we call the efficiency gap. And the efficiency gap is just the gap between the marginal rate of substitution and the marginal product of labor. Okay. So if you use these definitions of the wedges, you can check, okay, that this gap can be written as the sum of the two wedges, of the two markups, with a negative sign. Okay, that's just a sign, it's just a matter of convention. And this gap will always be negative, which is a way of saying that will be non-positive, sorry, which is a way of saying that the level of economic activity will typically be below the efficient level. It cannot be above the efficient level, where the efficient level here is described by the equality between the marginal rate of substitution and the marginal product of labor. Okay, very good. And here you have, in terms of the labor market diagram, the graphical description of these two wedges. So suppose the economy is here at this point. So now we no longer impose that we are at the intersection of labor, the perfectly competitive labor demand and perfectly competitive labor supply. The economy, again, in this very general framework, can be anywhere else, say at this point, okay, in which case the price markup is given by this distance between this point and the perfectly competitive labor demand schedule, and the wage markup is given by this distance, okay, between this point and the perfectly competitive labor supply schedule. This was the labor demand schedule, this labor supply schedule. Okay, very good. Now, let me put forward a hypothesis, namely that fluctuations, observed fluctuations, correspond largely to fluctuations in this efficiency gap. It doesn't have to be like that. Okay, the economy could be inefficient, and there are many reasons why the economy could be inefficient, but this inefficiency could be orthogonal, so to speak, to economic fluctuations. That is, this measure of inefficiency may be largely unrelated to economic fluctuations. Okay, or not. Okay, so let's try to evaluate this, and in order to do so, we need to come up with measures of this gap. Okay, so under some assumptions, we can measure fluctuations in the price markup and in the wage markup. So let me show you how. And so again, suppose that technology is given by this production function where X can include any inputs. Okay, the important thing is this isoelasticity with respect to labor. Then the marginal product of labor can be written is proportional to average labor productivity, as we all know. So we can write down the price markup, okay, which is the price minus the marginal cost, this way, just plugging in this expression for the marginal product of labor. And if you just do some straightforward rearrangement, we get this result that the price markup is proportional to the log of the labor income share, okay, which here I denote by ST, okay? So it's inversely related to the log of the labor income share. Okay, this is a result that goes back to Bob Hall's paper in 1988. Okay, so since we observe the labor income share, we can measure fluctuations in the price markup under the simple assumptions that I just made. Now let's consider the wage markup. Okay, so here's the definition of the wage markup. Let's impose the assumption on the marginal rate of substitution that we had made. Unfortunately, this labor supply parameters or shifter we don't observe. Okay, but here is a way to uncover the wage markup. Participation, or if you want the labor force, is and let me denote it by LT, is determined by the competitive labor supply. Okay, so that determines the quantity of a labor input that agents would want to supply in this economy if they could freely supply that labor input without any demand constraints, given the prevailing real wage and given consumption. Okay, now combine this definition of the wage markup with this definition of the labor of participation, and you get this simple relationship between the wage markup and the gap between labor participation and employment, which is that corresponds to the unemployment rate, UT. Since we observe the unemployment rate, we just need to make an assumption on phi, this parameter, which is a measure of the curvature of labor disutility, to uncover or to back out the measure of the wage markup. Okay, so in terms of our diagram, notice this proportionality between the wage markup, okay, which is given by this distance, and the unemployment rate, which is given by the distance between employment at any point in time and the quantity of labor that agents would want to supply given the prevailing wage, and that's what we define as the unemployment. So we see how the two will be related, and in terms of the simple linearized framework, they will be one will be proportional to the other. Okay, so now we can come up with an expression for the gap, which is just minus the sum of the two markups, and we get this simple expression. So we can use measures of the labor income share and the unemployment rate to come up to measure the gap, and as long as we have a measure of, we are willing to calibrate phi. And for the pictures that I will show you next, I'm going to assume that phi is equal to 1, but similar results hold for other reasonable values of phi. Okay, so here in red, you have a measure of the gap for the post-war US economy. Okay, again, this is normalized so that this is equal to normalized at the beginning. The absolute values don't mean much here. The main reason is that we don't directly observe this term here. Okay, so we can just focus on changes over time. Okay, so the first thing that we observe is a clear negative trend in the gap. Okay, which implies or should be interpreted as the US economy becoming less and less efficient over time. Okay. Now, if we look at the decomposition of the gap between the term associated with the price markup in green and the term associated with the wage markup, we see that this negative trend is largely related to the negative trend in the green line, which corresponds to an increase, a positive trend in the price markup. Okay, so this is consistent with recent evidence suggesting that market power in the goods market has been increasing over the past few decades, in particular since year 2000. Okay. Now the blue line is the labor market wedge, or if you want the measure of the fluctuations in the wage markup, that's more stationary, but displays important fluctuations. Okay. Now let's look at let's forget about the trends, the long-run trends, and let's focus on fluctuations. So here in blue, we have the detrended the detrended gap, the detrended efficiency gap, and in red, we have detrended employment. And again, we see there's a very strong positive correlation, and also that the the amplitude of fluctuations is of a similar order of magnitude. Okay, so this suggests that the business cycle, as we measure it, as here in terms of fluctuations in employment, is strongly related to fluctuations in the level of efficiency in the economy. That is, recessions are periods in the economy in which the economy is unusually inefficient, whereas booms are periods in which the degree of inefficiency in the economy somehow is reduced. Okay. Now, in terms of this, let me now go back to the employment equation I had shown you earlier for the neoclassical model. Now, in terms of this economy with wedges, we can rewrite the employment equation using the equation, combining the equations that I have just shown you like this. So this looks very much like the equation we had earlier, but now we have this additional term here involving the markups, okay? So we can see that any shock that generates sufficiently counter-cyclical markups, okay, may account for fluctuations in employment that coexist with procyclical consumption. Okay, so that allows us to overcome a main or a key problem that we had with the neoclassical framework. Okay, which namely that shocks other than technology and labor supply were not able to generate fluctuations in employment that could move positively with consumption. This is not necessarily the case here because we have this the flexibility that is allowed for by the existence of these markups that may fluctuate also in response to shocks. And if markups are negatively correlated to employment, that would be consistent, and if those fluctuations are sufficiently large, that may make it possible for consumption to move positively with employment. Okay, so this was a very general framework. Now we need to think of a model which has that generates some of those properties for those markups, and this is where the new Keynesian model comes in. Okay, so the new Keynesian model can be thought of as a model that generates counter-cyclical markups in response to a particular kind of shocks, the shocks that I will call aggregate demand shocks, which can be of a very different nature. Okay, so let me now describe the key elements of this framework. So there are two key elements that involve a departure from the assumptions of the neoclassical framework. So first, monopolistic competition in goods and labor markets. Okay, the existence of this monopolistic competition generates by itself the positive desired markups. Okay, firms and workers or unions representing workers set prices now and set wages in ways that imply or given or in a way consistent with some markups that they wish to maintain and which are positive. Okay, in contrast with the neoclassical framework. And what's also critical here is that both firms and workers face demand constraints. So they no longer can supply as much of the service or the good that they produce at the existing market price. Instead, they face some demand constraints on the quantity they can supply. Okay. So here you would have a representation of this. So in the solid lines represent the perfectly competitive labor supply and labor demand schedules that we had earlier, and the lines with dashes correspond to an economy in which there are constant positive price markups and constant positive wage markups. Okay, so and this would be the equilibrium. This point would be the equilibrium. Now it turns out that if this was the end of the story, we wouldn't make much progress because all the counterfactual predictions that I have discussed in the context of the neoclassical model would also apply here. Just that the economy would be shifted to the left. The level of economic activity would be inefficiently low, but in terms of the properties of fluctuations, nothing would be changed. So here's where the second key assumption of the new Keynesian framework plays an important role, the assumption of sticky prices and sticky wages. Okay, this assumption implies that markups do not remain constant at their desired levels, but instead they are what I like to call they are elastic. Okay, in the sense that firms and workers are willing to tolerate deviations of actual markups from their desired markups, presumably up to a point. Okay, but that those deviations are tolerated. And of course, there is a lot of, there are many papers that provide some micro foundations as to why those deviations would be tolerated in the presence of, say, some many costs. Okay, so here is so in this case, and we can think of the economy as being in a point like this, okay, away from the the perfectly competitive labor demand, perfectly competitive labor supply, and the economy in principle can move around in all directions. Of course, now we need to know what would drive the position of this economy. Okay, so here is one important implication in this economy in which markups are elastic, and hence, in a sense, we have freed ourselves from one of the constraints implied by the neoclassical framework. Aggregate demand plays a role. Okay, anything that changes aggregate demand, the quantity of goods that households want to consume, the quantity of capital that firms want to purchase, and so on. And this may include changes in policies, changes in expectations, whether they are rational or not, fluctuations in asset price bubbles that may affect households' wealth, and so on. All these if you want, exogenous factors may lead to changes in aggregate demand, and changes in aggregate demand will lead to changes in the quantity of output that firms want to produce, and hence on the quantity of employment they will need to hire in order to produce that output. And I represent this with this vertical line, which can be thought of as a labor demand schedule. Right? And the labor demand schedule now depends, in addition to technology, it depends on the quantity of output and hence on aggregate demand. Okay, and again, the economy can move from, say, a point like this to a point like this, because it no longer has the constraints implied by the need to have by the assumption of constant markups. Okay, or markups that are invariant to shocks. A particular case of which is the case of perfect competition, in which those markets are zero at all times. Okay, very good. So that generates many other implications. So, for instance, non-neutrality of monetary policy. Okay, monetary policy, but by changing the quantity of money supplied, or by altering the real interest rate, which is made possible because of stickiness of prices combined with changes in the nominal rate. So monetary policy will have an effect on aggregate demand, and in turn that will have an effect on employment and so on. Okay, and here it's important to emphasize that this non-neutrality of monetary policy has two dimensions in this new Keynesian framework. First, exogenous monetary policy shocks will have real effects, but also changes in monetary policy rules, in the endogenous component of monetary policy, will have effects on how the economy responds to shocks, okay, to shocks other than monetary policy shocks. In addition, and I don't have the time to elaborate on this here, one of the key insights of this new Keynesian framework is that these markup gaps that we saw are a key element in the determination of the degree of inefficiency in the economy, are also the more direct drivers or more approximate drivers of inflation, price inflation, and wage inflation. In fact, one can interpret price inflation and wage inflation as the result of price setting decisions by firms or wage setting decisions by workers that try to adjust or some of the least to restore or to realign deviations of their markups with the desired markups. Okay, so wage inflation and price inflation is a consequence of this misalignment between actual markups and desired markups. And of course, more generally, this framework implies a number of breakdowns of neoclassical predictions. And let me, just to illustrate this point, let me turn to the last topic of the last section of this lecture, which is which looks at the gains from wage flexibility through the lens of the new Keynesian framework and compares it to the conventional wisdom that is largely inherited, or it's largely shaped by the neoclassical, the predictions of the neoclassical model. And again, here I'm going to refer to some papers of mine, also with Tommaso Manicelli and Roberto Billi. Okay.
Jordi, we have about 5 minutes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
That's just what I need. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let me just remind you of the conventional view. It's the conventional view, so I guess it doesn't need to be reminded. The conventional view is that wage flexibility is good. Okay, and that's the view that permeates the thinking of many international organizations like the OECD, the IMF, and so on. Now this view, that's probably the view that an undergraduate student coming out of an economics 1 course may bring with him or her. It can be described by this simple diagram. So this, again, the labor market diagram that I've been using throughout. Okay, so suppose that we're in this equilibrium. Okay, again, this is a neoclassical model, and suppose that there is an adverse shift to labor demand. Okay, and suppose that wages are fully flexible. Now the economy will go from point A to point B. Okay, and the equilibrium will be restored. Unemployment will be 0. And employment will decline from N0 to N1. Okay. Now suppose that wages are rigid for whatever reason, then the economy will move from point A to point C, and here you see that the decline in employment is larger. Now there is unemployment and so on. Okay. So clearly, the rigidity of wages doesn't seem to benefit the economy. And it may benefit some sectors of the economy, the workers who have remained employed, but in general, from an aggregate point of view, it only amplifies the volatility of employment. Okay, so we tend to think of it as undesirable. Now, the new Keynesian framework offers a completely different perspective on this. Okay, because changes in wages do not have a direct effect on labor demand in a world described by the new Keynesian model. Instead, the relationship between wages and employment is one that it's a bit more convoluted. And the way it works is as follows. Suppose that there is a decline in the nominal wage, that will, other things equal, that will tend to reduce the marginal cost of firms. And as firms adjust their prices, they will gradually adjust their prices down, and there will be deflation. Okay. Now the central bank will respond to lower inflation by lowering the interest rate under a conventional interest rate rule. Since prices are sticky, the reduction in the nominal interest rate, which is what the central bank does, will also reduce the real rate. And the reduction in the real rate will stimulate consumption, aggregate demand, and since firms are willing to accommodate changes in the quantity of output they produce to changes in aggregate demand, output will go up. And of course, in order to produce more output, they will want to hire more workers. Okay, so there's this negative relationship between wages and employment that is also a feature of the neoclassical model, but it's one that it's more indirect, and in particular, and that's what I want to emphasize, it is mediated by the response of the central bank to changes in inflation. Okay, in the absence of this response, things could be different. Okay, so this is something that I emphasized in a paper in 2013. That was the EEA presidential address, which was published in GIA. So consider an economy, a new Keynesian economy, which the central bank follows this familiar Taylor rule. It adjusts the nominal interest rate in response to changes in inflation and output. Okay, so these are the welfare losses in this economy. Okay, as a measure of the parameter of wage stickiness that you have here, and the inflation coefficient phi pi. okay? So if the inflation coefficient is large enough, say around 2, okay, the conventional wisdom applies. A reduction in wage stickiness, that is, if we move from a high value of these wage stickiness parameters towards a low value, that's an increase in wage flexibility, reduces welfare losses, okay? However, if the central bank is not aggressive enough in responding to inflation, then this mechanism will be weakened, okay? And we see that in that case, a reduction in wage stickiness, that is an increase in wage flexibility, may actually lead to either locally or globally, okay, depending on the value of this inflation coefficient, to an increase in welfare losses. That is, it may be undesirable, okay? Very good. Let me give you another example. The exchange rate regime, that's what we addressed in my paper with Tommaso Monacelli, okay? Now, suppose an economy that follows an inflation targeting monetary policy strategy and doesn't worry about the exchange rate, okay? So in this economy, if the central bank is sufficiently aggressive at responding to inflation, and here we assume that the central bank fully stabilizes inflation, so this would be strict inflation targeting, we see that a reduction in the parameter of wage stickiness, this theta W, that is moving from 1 towards 0, reduces welfare losses. Okay, so this is consistent with the conventional view. However, if this economy joins a currency union, and if the economy is small relative to the union as a whole, even if the central bank of the union, responds to inflation of the union, it will not respond to inflation of the small economy that belongs to the union. And in that case, that key element in the chain of causality between changes in wages and employment will break apart. And again, we have the possibility of, at least locally, that an increase in wage flexibility, that there is a reduction in wage stickiness, actually increases welfare losses, as you can see here. Another example in which that link between changes in wages and aggregate demand will break down is when the zero lower bound is binding, okay? Because in that case, the central bank, will not adjust the nominal interest rate in response to changes in inflation. And this is what we, the question that we addressed in a recent paper with Roberto Billi. And again, without getting into the details, you see that when the ZLB is present, when there is a zero lower bound constraint on the nominal interest rate, the increase in welfare losses as wages become more flexible can be larger than in the absence of the zero lower bound, okay, which is represented here by the blue line. Okay, very good. So this is the simple, an example, an illustration of how different some of the implications of the predictions of the new Keynesian framework can be from their their counterparts in the neoclassical framework. So let me just conclude now, okay, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. So the basic point of my talk, or the basic message that I wanted to convey, is that in order to understand economic fluctuations, we need to depart somehow, some way, from the real business cycle neoclassical paradigm, okay? And the new Keynesian framework provides one way, but the one that I think is particularly useful, and I would say also quite realistic, to depart from that neoclassical paradigm and to thus help us understand fluctuations. Obviously, it has its own limitations, and but I don't have the time to address those. Now, a key element in that new Keynesian framework is this notion that I propose of elastic markups. Okay, markups with firms and workers willing to tolerate variations in their markups relative to the desired levels, and that implies a central role for aggregate demand and thus monetary policy in determining output and employment. An important implication of this is that there is no prediction of the model that is invariant to the monetary policy rule in place. Okay, things may be very different. The effects of any shock, it may be very different depending on how the central bank responds to that shock. okay, because monetary policy is not neutral. And the example, the illustration that I have given you regarding the gains from wage flexibility, I think is an example of this. Now, in recent years, over the past few years, we have seen an emergence of very interesting literature that tries to go beyond the representative agent that has dominated macroeconomics for the past 3 decades. Okay. Now, interestingly, many authors tried to incorporate this heterogeneity of households, say idiosyncratic shocks and so on, in the past in the context of RBC models. Okay. But with little impact. And the reason is that in those models, output is determined by the supply side, and heterogeneity of the demand side will have, I'd say, across households and so on, will have very little impact on aggregate fluctuations. Instead, this is different in new Keynesian models, and that's why we have this current boom of so-called Hank models, heterogeneous agent new Keynesian models, because in those models, in new Keynesian models, there's a role for aggregate demand. Then, to the extent that different households, the households differ in terms of their marginal propensities to consume, there is a key role of redistribution in determining the level of economic activity, because redistribution will affect aggregate demand and hence the level of economic activity. Okay, whereas that effect wouldn't be present in the neoclassical framework. So in particular, transmission of monetary policy will be shaped by its distributional effects, and also policies that we had somehow put aside, not even thought about as a stabilizing policies, like income policies, will play an important role as a stabilizing policies. And by income policies, I mean things like the minimum wage or basic income. Okay, well, so I'm done, Chrissy. Sorry if I have taken up a little more time than
Thank you.
been given to me.
Thank you very much.